Even though the first game in the Final Fantasy type franchise only released in 2011, as a whole, it's seen probably more change than the rather temperamental English weather. To be blunt, I feel like I'd be doing it something of a disservice if I described it as anything other than a bit of a mess, although I will admit that they've done a great job at somehow managing to hold it all together. Even before the latest change, which saw Final Fantasy Type-0 Online rebranded as Final Fantasy Awakening in China at the end of last year, what's actually going on with the franchise has always been a bit of a head scratcher. I mean, over the past 10 years, we've had name changes, platform changes, and spin-offs all happening within what's ultimately still a rather infant franchise. It fascinates me though, and I must apologise profusely about the fact it's taken me 5 months to pull this together. After my last video about Final Fantasy Awakening back in November, so many of you were asking for a follow-up. I'm sorry it's taken so long, but I assure you it will be worth it. And I hope that this video will serve as a comprehensive history for the Final Fantasy type franchise, while also ironing out confusion that's come from changes that you may or may not even be aware of since its inception. And to do that, we have to start right back at the beginning, in June 2006. So let's take a leap back in time and head to the grand stage of E3 2006. Because both Final Fantasy Type-0 and Final Fantasy Agito, as we now know them, both started life as Final Fantasy Agito XIII, a game announced alongside Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy Versus 13 to form a trilogy of titles within the Fabula Nova Crystallis sub-franchise. To try and go along with Yuichi Wada's polymorphic content philosophy, unlike Final Fantasy XIII and Versus 13, which were being developed for home consoles, Agito 13 would instead try to replicate the success of Before Crisis, Final Fantasy VII, and hit mobile phones, offering access to the Final Fantasy XIII universe while on the go. It was also a natural fit, as Hajime Tabata signed on as director after finishing up with Before Crisis. But it wasn't too long until we had our first change, as despite not announcing it at the time and reiterating that it was designed only for mobile and nowhere else, Hajime Tabata told Famitsu in 2008 that they were also working on a PSP version and that they had been since launch. They just didn't want to tell anyone about it for whatever reason. Well, I know the reason, but we'll get onto that in a minute. Either way, it was a nice little PR move as preparation for the next change, which was the discrete cancellation of the mobile version so that they could focus on the PSP version exclusively. Now, over the next few years, they showed small bits like a screenshot from a closed mega theatre and a new trailer for the PSP version, but it took a full 3 years, yep, we're now at 2011, until we next heard anything substantial about Final Fantasy Agito XIII. Part of the reason for the long delays was that the game just kept getting pushed in favour of other titles. In the first instance, this was Crisis Core. It was said during the DK Sigma 3713 party that Tabata was having to work on the entire story outline by himself, and that's something which he confirmed during a later interview with Dengeki in 2011, where he noted that it was only himself, Nomura and Naora working on the game during its first 2 years. It was so bad that they almost flat out cancelled the game. And that goes back to what I alluded to earlier, why they weren't forthcoming with information like the fact that they were working on a PSP version. It's not that they didn't want to, they just had literally nothing that they could say. I mean, in the same interview, Naora mentioned that when they announced Agito 13, they only had one piece of concept art. That's it. And by the time they could actually focus on the game, technology had moved on and their original plans just weren't viable anymore. Even back in 2011, Naora said that he'd never worked on a game as long as he had been for Agito 13. And not that he actually said this part, but I guess he'd also never worked on a game for so long while achieving so little. It just serves as another classic example of Square Enix announcing a game way too early. Something they just can't stop doing. Anyway, getting back to our little history lesson here, it was in 2011 that we learned that Agito 13 would be changing its name to Final Fantasy Type-0. They also considered Final Fantasy Live due to the game's multiplayer elements, but the team felt Type-0 was a better fit as the 0 reflected them starting anew. Internally, this change actually happened back in 2009 when the game started full development, because after the team saw the results of pre-production, they felt it should be more of an independent title as opposed to something under the Final Fantasy XIII umbrella, and they even laid down plans for future entries, trademarking Type 1, Type 2 and Type 3. And as a fun fact here, this name change also led to them amending the Fabula Nova Crystallis logo to remove that 13 Roman numeral. Now, after a short delay, the game would actually then release later that year in Japan, 5 years after its original announcement. and they then started working on a localized version for the West. And this saw significant progression. Orion Akaba also posted on his public Facebook page stating that he'd recorded his part as 9 back in 2012. But despite all of this, Square Enix ultimately decided not to release the game on PSP in the West, and instead chose to later port it to the PS4 and Xbox One as Type-0 HD in early 2015. So yeah, with just one game, we've gone from a mobile exclusive title through to a PSP exclusive that then changed its name, and after it released got ported over to home consoles in the generation after. Pretty straightforward, right? Well sure, until you factor in Final Fantasy Agito, which was announced 2 years after the release of Final Fantasy Type-0. Yep, after saying they'd moved away from the Agito XIII name because they wanted to create a standalone franchise, they announced a new game that went back to using the Agito name. Sure, they did ditch the 13 part, but it's still somewhat confusing, but that's not the half of it. Instead of coming up with an original concept of Final Fantasy Agito, we learnt that it was actually going to be based off of the original concept for Final Fantasy Agito XIII, the game that was announced in 2006. Now, it's at this point where things start to become a little convoluted, but it does actually make sense. You see, when they decided to shift focus towards the PSP, they also decided to move almost entirely away from the original concept and started working on something different. It's why they ended up changing the name of the game, as it no longer represented the original vision. The issue, if you can call it that, was that Tabata still really liked the original version that they had planned for Agito XIII, and you can kind of understand why. I mean, he came up with it. It would have been an episodic game with elements linked to real-world day-night cycles, a nugget which he shared in the Final Fantasy Type-0 guidebook. So with Type-0 shipped, Tabata decided to go back and start working again on Agito XIII for mobiles again as originally planned, except this time it would just be called Final Fantasy Agito. The way I see it, Final Fantasy Agito wasn't actually announced in 2013. It was announced in 2006 and then just re-announced in 2013. Type-0 is ultimately just an offshoot of the original Agito XIII that ended up overshadowing the original game. Anyway, due to his commitments with Final Fantasy XV, which he was now working on, instead of serving as director on Final Fantasy Agito, Tabata served as the game's producer and entrusted Agito to former staff members who had previously worked on the original Agito XIII. Masayasu Nishida, who was actually a level designer in Agito XIII, became the game's director, and Sayako Hoshino, who was a character texture artist on Agito XIII, served as the art director. With a clear vision, they managed to turn the game around in under 2 years, and Agito released in May 2014 in Japan. Now with Final Fantasy Type-0 and Agito released, it's from here that things start to get a little interesting. Well, I guess more messy than interesting. I mean, a few months later, it was announced at E3 2014 that Final Fantasy Agito was going to be localized for the Western market. Apparently they just can't resist a good tease. At the 2014 Tokyo Game Show, Square Enix also announced that Final Fantasy Agito Plus, a more substantial version of the game, was entering into development on the PS Vita. Exciting times, right? Well, you'd think so, but both of these announcements became void not long after. Despite Square Enix North America announcing the localization of Final Fantasy Agito, Square Enix Japan subsequently stated that they would stop supporting Final Fantasy Agito as of November 2015. It therefore meant that the promised localization would not happen. Gold star for communication there, guys. They also cancelled Final Fantasy Agito Plus due to technical difficulties with the porting process. It was announced in March 2015 that they had encountered a bug and were waiting for Sony's assistance before they were able to proceed any further, which I'm guessing wasn't forthcoming as they decided to just cancel the game instead. Later that month, they also announced that Final Fantasy Agito was being ported to Windows 10, but that didn't materialise either. Cue in the next phase in this journey, Final Fantasy Type-0 Online. Following along from the announcement that Final Fantasy Agito Plus had been cancelled and that Final Fantasy Agito would cease its service, Square Enix revealed that Final Fantasy Agito would be replaced by Final Fantasy Type-0 Online. This would be developed by a third-party company called Perfect World, and it would now be coming to PC and mobile. With this announcement, Western localization also went from being officially confirmed when it was Agito, to ceasing, to something that was then under consideration with Type-0 Online, and then reconfirmed again. Although we've actually heard nothing on this front since, apart from Perfect World saying that they don't have the publishing rights for Japan and other territories, so aren't in a position to comment. Upon reflection, it's still difficult for me to fathom how such a small franchise can be put through so much turmoil. But it doesn't even stop there. Even if it's a little confusing and thematically it probably should have been called Final Fantasy Agito Online, I can give them a free pass for calling it Final Fantasy Type-0 Online because Type-0 has more marketing potential. It's a bigger brand, having sold well in Japan and receiving huge promotion due to the HD remaster. But they then reneged on this naming, deciding to rebrand it as Final Fantasy Awakening in China, presumably because Final Fantasy Type-0 Online felt like too much of a barrier, as it insinuated that there was an offline experience that should be checked out first. Think of it as somewhat similar to the logic behind the decision to call it Final Fantasy 2 and 3 as opposed to 4 and 6. I feel like they wanted to remove the barrier where people felt like they'd missed something. Either way though, it's a decision that paid off, with Final Fantasy Awakening achieving more than 2 million downloads within 2 weeks after launch in China. Anyway, so yeah, that's everything that we know about the Final Fantasy type franchise, and now that we're all caught up, I feel as though there are some questions that all of this throws up, at least from my perspective. The first is rather blunt. Will we ever get to experience the story of Final Fantasy Agito in the West? At this point, I'd say it's quite unlikely. There was clearly an appetite prior to the release of Final Fantasy Type-0 HD, but perhaps sales performance when it released dampened that enthusiasm. Clearly, Square Enix still feel there is potential for the franchise within the Asian market, otherwise Final Fantasy Type-0 wouldn't even exist, even if they did ultimately ditch the name in China. The second question therefore is, does this officially mean that the Final Fantasy Agito brand is now dead? Square Enix could have easily branded Final Fantasy Type-0 Online as Final Fantasy Agito Online, or they could have even just continued using Final Fantasy Agito Plus and repurposing the game as opposed to just cancelling it. They have instead, perhaps to strengthen its proposition, attempted to consolidate the brands under one banner for the Asian market moving forward. And given the flexibility Square Enix will also have should they choose to proceed with further iterations like Type 1 or Type 2, it's therefore difficult to see them ever going back to the Agito brand. I feel like Tabata was the big driving force behind going back to the Agito name, and I can't see him being too involved with this franchise moving forward. The third question relates to the sheer turmoil that this sub-franchise has gone through. Can this franchise continue to survive after so many critical changes? If you aren't following it closely, it's not too difficult to see why people would be confused and therefore put off by the theatrics. There have been platform changes, and this doesn't even include the false promise of receiving Final Fantasy Type-0 on PS Vita, which was even announced and then retracted. There have been name changes, and there have also been reneged promises relating to localization. I mean, with the original game, they said they were working on it, then just stopped talking about it and kind of avoided the question. And with Final Fantasy Agito, again, they announced that they were doing a localized version, and then it just never appeared. But the weird thing is, there's still a lot of hype around this franchise, and if it's going to be a success for Square Enix on a global scale moving forward, I feel they have to be very careful about how it's handled. For now, I can't help but feel as though it's turning into nothing more than a side attraction for the wrong reasons. If they want to continue to grow it, and I genuinely hope they do, the next big opportunity lies with Final Fantasy Type 1 or Next or whatever they want to call it, which of course was teased with both the trademark news and also that lovely trailer at the end of Final Fantasy Type-0 HD. Where I don't feel their growth lies is with the spin-off titles they keep messing around with. They just need to make sure that everything is more joined up in the future if they want to avoid another Crystal Chronicles, a promising franchise that just died a death due to too much dilution and a lack of direction. So yeah, that's the history of the Final Fantasy type franchise you probably weren't quite aware about. It's been through something of a crazy rollercoaster ride since its announcement back in 2006, and in the West, we still only had one game, which is quite crazy to think about. Were you guys aware of just how much turmoil there had been? And are you guys excited for the prospect of Type 1 or Type Next? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Also, be sure to head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/FFunion to find out how you can support our channel and even get your name at the end of videos like these folks. We're also going to start doing giveaways exclusive for our Patreon supporters. And we've got one this Friday where we're going to be giving away a Final Fantasy XV Abbey Road poster. If you want to get your name in the draw, head over there to find out how. Alright, thanks for watching guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'll see you next time.